Okay, so you've just gotten home from your local comic book shop, taken off your shoes, put your coat away, and you're ready to dig into all the cool stuff you bought. You sit down in your favorite spot, you get situated, you open your first floppy or graphic novel, and you're halfway through that first page when you stop and take a good look at one of those word balloons or awesome sound effects and think, "Hi, I'm John, and this is Who Does That?, where we talk about who does what in comics. Today we're talking about letterers, the fine folks who put all those words into the comics. When we talk about lettering, what letterers actually do, we mean those words in the bubbles, balloons, boxes, and more. We also mean the sound effects and the visual indicators of noise. Some of you out there might call those onomatopoeias, and if you do, you're correct. Congrats. But for the purposes of this video, we'll use sound effects because that's easier for me to say. In short, letterers are responsible for the letters on the page. I probably should have just said that to begin with, it's way easier. So this sounds pretty simple, right? But is it? Sure, you can slap some letters in a circle and plop that onto your art and call it a day, but is that really lettering? I've lettered my own comics for a few years now, and I can tell you that it's not strictly easy. When I started, my focus was on getting all the words into a balloon without crowding the panel and the art. I didn't even try sound effects because they were way too intimidating. I don't have a setup to make them easily on my computer, so that was just a no-go. I wasn't terribly happy with the results, even though they were readable, but there were areas where I needed improvement. For example, it's difficult to see in which order these bubbles should be read in. That's going to trip up the reader. But if we do this, it makes the order much more obvious and the reader knows which left to right, top to bottom order to go in. How about this? It looks a little bloated on the page. There's also two thoughts here in the same bubble. If we do this, the page is less cluttered and the flow of conversation looks a little more natural, like the character took a pause. Also, once I got more confident with my work, I even started doing sound effects. I was really proud of this one. Check it out. Whoosh! This is all to say that lettering is not just putting words on the pages with tails going to the correct person. It's its own art form entirely. I spent a lot of time reading comics that were coming out from major companies to see what they thought was good lettering to get ideas of how to improve mine. Learning from the pros is always the best way to understand how something's done. Hey, that sounds like a great segue. Educational material. Here are a couple books you should consider if you're interested in starting your own lettering journey. Comic Book Lettering, The Comicraft Way by Richard Starkings and John Rochelle, and The Essential Guide to Comic Book Lettering by Nate Picos. Richard Starkings and John Rochelle have a company called Comicraft. Let's check out the site's About Us section. Purveyors of unique design and fine lettering, the award-winning Comicraft studio is best known for pioneering the use of the computer in the art of comic book lettering. Since 1995, the Comicraft font library has satisfied the font needs of discerning customers all over the world, including... Whoa, that is an impressive list. I think it's safe to say they know a thing or two about this process and what goes into it. Now, as far as Nate Picos, he has a website called Blambot. The About section there says, Blambot is a world-class collection of fonts created by award-winning comic book letterer and graphic designer Nate Picos. For nearly 20 years, Blambot has been serving the independent and professional world of graphic design and comic book publishing with typography uniquely tailored to both traditional print and digital media. Blambot's client list includes virtually every major comic book publisher, movies, television, novels, and merchandising of all kinds. Blambot is not only where you go to get top-notch fonts, but logo design, lettering, and custom typefaces too. Image Comics publishes this book themselves, so that is a hell of an endorsement of Nate and his work. I've used these two books on my lettering journey to understand the art behind it and learn some great tips and tricks for doing it more efficiently and smartly. I highly recommend picking them up. But, like I said, learning from the pros is the best way to go about something, so I reached out to a few and asked them some questions about lettering. Meet Lucas. I've worked with him on a project before, and he was kind enough to talk about his craft. And this is Justin. Justin is someone I know through my editor who is interested in dropping some knowledge about lettering. And, finally, Nate Picos. Yeah, the guy who wrote the book that I recommended. He agreed to answer some questions too. So each of these fine folks were sent the same group of questions by me and gave their own answers. We're going to go through them and learn a thing or two. Knowledge. Okay, question 1. In your words, what is lettering? How would you describe it to someone who doesn't know what it is? Comic book lettering is the art of designing most of the verbal elements of the comic book page. Though many integral artists take care of their own lettering, in the highly professionalized comic book industry, it is now a full-fledged position held usually by pros with a deep knowledge of graphic design, typesetting, and sequential storytelling. I would describe it as anytime you see words in a comic, inside the balloons, the sound effects, and sometimes even the signs on storefronts. Oh, and don't forget the balloons themselves. That's a good point that I forgot to mention earlier. The balloons are part of lettering, making their shapes, their tails attaching to the correct characters, and more. Comic book lettering deals with any written language appearing in a comic book. The letterer is a graphic designer who creates all the expressive dialogue, sound effects, and logos in a comic. That's the second time we've seen that term with regards to lettering, and it's probably good to highlight it. Graphic design, apart from being my passion, is an integral part of lettering. It's probably good to look into growing your own foundational knowledge of it if you're thinking of becoming a letterer. On to the second question. What do you believe is the most important thing to remember when lettering a book? What is essential to doing it right? I think the most important single thing to remember in order to do a proper lettering job is to match the tone of the story, both visually but also in terms of intent. It's why for me, as a letterer, it's really helpful to get a summary of the story. I'll be lettering, is it a comedy, drama, action, thriller, slice of life? What's the target audience? What's the illustration and coloring style? All that informs me on making appropriate decisions to ensure lettering feels cohesive instead of just an afterthought. I think this will vary from letterer to letterer, but I'm big on reading order. I'll cover art if it means the panel/page will read in the correct order. Honestly, reading order is something a lot of first-time comic readers struggle with, and I can definitely see readability being a high priority when lettering. The difference between an average letterer and a really good one is graphic design skill, whether that skill is natural-born talent or gained through study. Almost anyone can do a poor job of lettering. The best letterers can take good art and make it better seamlessly. When lettering is done well, it's not something the reader typically focuses on, like the soundtrack of a movie. But when it's done poorly, it can bring the entire experience down. Look, I said it was my passion, not my strong suit. Moving on! What are some things writers and artists always need to consider when working with a letterer? Things they shouldn't forget, or should think of when they're writing or drawing the art. For writers, I'd say one of the most essential things is to do a good lettering pass of the script. That is, editing the script to account for any pages or panels where the artist might have deviated from the original description. Say the artist drew 9 panels in a page where the original idea had only 3. The script the letterer gets has to acknowledge that so that we have a clear reference where all elements should fit. Also important is to make sure every lettering bit is itemized and separated from the panel description, and even better, in a single line break. There's a couple of very interesting articles about script formatting here. As for artists, it might sound like a no-brainer, but the single most essential thing they should consider is to always leave enough space for the balloons and sound effects to fit into the panel. Theory says at least 20% of any panel should be left open for balloons, but in multiple back and forth conversations, that might have to be a much higher percentage. There's really good information since I've been guilty of writing too much on a page with not enough space for all that text. 2 big things that I think get overlooked. The first speaking character should be on the left of the panel. It makes things tricky when they aren't. The second is that more panels on a page does not mean you can fit more words on that page. It's the opposite since you have less room. I have absolutely done this faux pas, my editor can vouch for that. Writers need to remember that comics is a visual medium, i.e., show me, don't tell me. So the dialogue should not overwhelm a page. Writers also need to know that the script they hand to the letterer needs to be final. Rewrites are the bane of the letterer's job, as it chips away at our page rate time spent on a single project. Artists need to be conscious of enough negative space in the art for the letterer to make decisions about placement of lettering. Huge one here. It's not a novel, folks. Comics having pictures means you have to consider those when making your stories. Let the art carry some of your intention and nuance. What does a letterer not do? What's something people shouldn't ask letterers to do, but you get asked to do all the time? I can name 2 things, though to be honest, I'd say most of the creators I work with tend to be very mindful of a letterer's obligations. The first is quite general, and it involves any kind of addition that letterers shouldn't have to tackle. That ranges from revising the script, which yes, we can correct a typo or 2 if we find it, to editing artwork in order to fit the proper page guidelines. None of those tasks are inherent to lettering, so they should be handled by the pertinent creator. The second one is quite specific and a bit of a gray area, as there's some colleagues that might not agree. Letterers should only handle proper lettering elements related to sequential storytelling, such as balloons, captions in all their ranges, and sound effects. Any other signage that appears on the page and is related to the artwork, like street or shop signs, should be handled by the artist, who usually has a better grasp of perspective and style to ensure those elements look cohesive. But different letterers are comfortable handling different elements, so I'd always ask in advance. This is a two for here. Firstly, hire an editor if you want someone to go over your work and make those edits. That's what they're there for. Secondly, just because letterers know graphic design principles does not make them graphic designers. It's one of those not all squares are rectangles, but all rectangles are squares sorts of things. Send them the fonts I used on a book so they can make those edits themselves. Don't get me wrong, I'll gladly send you a list of every font I used on a book, but I'm not going to send you the font itself. Let the letterer do the job you hired them to do. If you're going to go in after a letterer has done their thing, it is poor form. Get your writing the way you want it before you send it to them so that this doesn't happen. We're not editors. Even though we are more frequently getting scripts that haven't been proofread for mistakes or misspellings, we inevitably have to make corrections on the fly. It behooves a letterer to spot and correct missing commas, incorrect punctuation, etc. during the initial lettering so that we don't have to go back later during the correction process to make those changes. Once again, this plays into our page rate time. What is the hardest part of lettering? I have to say networking, probably, especially for me since I don't live in the US, so I can't make personal contact at cons or other events. But I've known many US colleagues that claim this too, mostly regarding breaking through to big publishers. Also dealing with non-standardized artwork files or ill-formatted scripts, which results in having to invest some extra time in making sure that's properly dealt with. Other than that, I can say I enjoy each and every step of the lettering process. Networking is hard. I almost feel like it should be the topic of a whole different video. That being said, if you're building a social network of comics peers, don't overlook letterers. For me, it's sound effects and making them unique. After a while, all my bangs and kabooms start to look the same. Oh man, I definitely agree with this one. And again, that fwash was particularly transcendent. I think that would change depending on which letterer you ask. For some, it's getting more work. For others, it's poor page rates. For me, it's juggling projects to always meet and exceed deadlines. I pride myself on not missing deadlines. Nate's point kind of proves itself with those previous answers from Justin and Lucas, but as a general rule of thumb, deadlines are really crucial for people. Do you have any advice for folks starting on their lettering journey? Yes, read a lot of comics. Start noticing when lettering works and when it doesn't, and ask yourself why. Pay attention to details. This, in turn, will ruin your comic book reading experience. Trust me, it has for me. Look at how pros handle things. Follow them on social media. If possible, get some lettering reading material. Blambot's Nate Picos' essential guide is, well, essential. But if you can't afford it, then be inquisitive and search online for lettering tips and processes. Again, many tips on Blambot's site. Look for Jim Campbell's blog. That's where I learned the basics. Oh hey, Lucas recommended Nate's book too. I'll also link the blog he calls out in the description below. Read and study comics. Look at what's being done in some of your favorite comics and take a mental note of it. Ask a lot of questions. A lot of letterers are very approachable and will gladly answer whatever questions you may have. Justin's got a point about reaching out. If you don't do it, you may never learn. It is absolutely intimidating to talk to other folks when you're just starting out. I really empathize with that. But I can also back up what he said here about folks being friendly. I was trying to figure out how to make squinks for a thing I was lettering and posted a tweet asking for help. Like 4 people responded, some with video tutorials about how to do it. Seriously, it pays to admit you don't know a thing and ask for help. Study up on graphic design. Examine comics from all eras to see how lettering was handled and to determine which letterers are their favorites. They can also get involved with the lettering community online. There aren't many good books out there on the subject, but they can always find a copy of the DC Guide to Coloring and Lettering, or my book, The Essential Guide to Comic Book Lettering. Some of the same advice here from Nate about reading and researching, and I have to respect the plug for his own book. It's not called Essential for nothing. But I think seeing that many of these answers have the same themes and ideas in them is both reassuring and reaffirming. This advice and these perspectives are shared, which usually means that they're pretty standard, and that's helpful for folks starting out, or for others who need refreshing. I hope this was informative and inspires you to check out lettering a little more closely when you're reading your favorite comic. Or it's got you hyped up to do some lettering of your own. See you next time.